He didn't make me feel safe with soft words or sweet gestures. There were no good morning, beautiful texts, no arms constantly wrapped around me. His presence wasn't sugary, it was solid, like something ancient and unshakable had just sat down beside me. I didn't understand it at first. I kept waiting for romance the way I'd been taught to recognize it. But with him, there were no fireworks, just this strange, steady quiet that made my nervous system relax before my mind could even catch up. I used to equate safety with affection, with warmth, with men who told me what I wanted to hear, held me tight when I cried, promised forever in moments of emotional intensity. But he wasn't that man. He didn't rush to comfort me. He didn't fill the air with reassurances. He just stayed, present, attentive, completely grounded. And that unsettled me at first, because it wasn't emotional safety the way I'd known it. It was something deeper, something that didn't need permission to exist. It was just there. There was a day I broke down in front of him, overwhelmed, unraveling, messy. I expected him to jump into action, to console, to wrap me in emotional bubble wrap, but he didn't. He didn't flinch. He just sat across from me and held the space. His gaze didn't soften, but it didn't turn away either. It wasn't tenderness that made me feel safe. It was his unshakability, like he could absorb the weight of my chaos without losing his center. Like he wasn't afraid of my fire because he'd walked through his own. I kept waiting for the sweet moments, for the playful affection, the grand declarations, the romantic softness. But that wasn't how he moved. His love was practical, quiet, structural. He didn't pour sugar on my wounds. He gave me spine when mine was collapsing. He didn't say, "You're okay." He looked at me like I already was. And somehow, that was more powerful than any soothing words. Because it didn't petty me. It didn't shrink me. It trusted me. And that kind of trust felt safer than sweetness ever could. What made me feel safest wasn't how he held me. It was how he held himself, the way he moved with certainty, the way he didn't reach for my hand to steady himself, the way his silence didn't feel distant, but intentional. His presence didn't wrap me in comfort, it anchored me. And it scared me at first, because it wasn't what I was used to. But the longer I sat in it, the more I realized safety doesn't always feel soft. Sometimes it feels like stillness, like a man who never once had to say, "I've got you," because you could feel that he did. He didn't try to fix me. That was the first thing I noticed. He wasn't a savior. He didn't lean in with eager solutions or rush to wipe away my tears. He watched, he listened, and he let me unravel without turning my breakdown into his performance. That restraint, it felt harsh, almost cold, until I realized it was respect. He wasn't trying to rescue me because he believed I could rescue myself. His presence didn't coddle. It challenged me to rise, and oddly, that made me feel more protected than any comfort ever had. When I vented, he didn't interrupt. He didn't offer clicks or emotional hand holding. He let me speak without shrinking my pain or dressing it up with artificial sympathy. His silence wasn't avoidance, it was presence. Focused, controlled. He wasn't trying to be liked in that moment. He was being useful, and I started to notice how rare that was. Most people try to make you feel better so they can feel better. But he never moved from that place. He didn't need me to be okay for him to stay calm. He wasn't romantic in the way I'd imagined. No poetic texts, no candlelit dinners. He didn't use words to create a fantasy. He created reality, a rhythm, a sense of structure I didn't know I was craving. He didn't say, "I miss you" every night, but he showed up on time. He didn't compliment me every day, but he never forgot the things I told him in passing. And slowly, I realized I didn't need sweetness. I needed solidity. And he gave me that, not through affection, but through absolute reliability. There were moments I expected him to get emotional, to match my energy, to react with heat. But he didn't. He absorbed intensity like a wall built for weather. Not because he didn't feel, but because he knew how to carry weight without throwing it back. That used to frustrate me. I mistook it for indifference. But now I know it takes more strength to remain calm than it does to explode. And his calm didn't make me feel dismissed. It made me feel held, not in his arms, but in his energy. I used to think love meant softness. That safety came in the form of whispers and warmth and constant affirmation. But he redefined all of that. With him, safety wasn't about emotional sugar. It was about the absence of chaos. It was knowing that no matter how loud I got, he wouldn't get louder. that no matter how messy things felt, he would stay collected. And it wasn't because he didn't care, it was because he cared deeply, but without drama. And that kind of strength, it built a kind of safety that sweetness alone never could. He had a way of taking up space without demanding attention. He didn't need to be loud to be known. Just by being in the room, he shifted the air. His presence didn't soothe, it centered. And for someone like me, who was used to constantly managing the emotional temperature of others, that was disorienting. I kept waiting for his energy to fluctuate, for his mood to change with mine. But it didn't. He stayed the same, steady. And though I didn't understand it at first, I later realized that was the safety I'd never had. Most of the men before him made me feel needed because they were unstable. They needed my comfort, my affirmation, my softness to feel secure, and in giving that I felt important. But him, he didn't need anything from me to feel whole. He didn't ask me to fix him or manage his emotions. And at first, that made me feel replaceable, like I had no purpose. But slowly, that perception shifted. I wasn't irrelevant, I was free to be, not to perform. And that, oddly enough, was what safety was always supposed to feel like. His emotional discipline wasn't something he talked about. He just was. When things got hard, he didn't spiral. When I pulled away, he didn't chase. When I challenged him, he didn't retaliate, he listened. Not to defend, but to understand. And that kind of presence, calm in the face of conflict, was unfamiliar to me. It felt too quiet, too mature, too unshakable. But in the absence of emotional volatility, I began to see how much of my idea of closeness was built on tension. And his peace rewired everything. One night, after a particularly hard conversation, I remember thinking, he's not trying to win me. He wasn't negotiating. He wasn't scrambling to reassure me. He just sat there, steady, clear, certain of who he was and how he loved. He didn't over-explain. He didn't prove. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't before. The absence of pressure. I didn't have to carry the moment. I didn't have to perform emotional intelligence to make him feel safe. He already was. And that, in turn, made me feel safe. Safety with him didn't come from being protected from the world. It came from being allowed to be my full self without needing to protect him from it. I didn't have to filter. I didn't have to soften every edge. He didn't make me feel like my strength was too much or my feelings were too heavy. He wasn't impressed by performance. He valued presence. And in that quiet, firm acceptance, I finally experienced a kind of safety that didn't make me smaller, it made me still. And for someone like me, stillness was the sweetest shock of all. I used to confuse emotional availability with emotional reaction. If someone cried with me, argued back, or raised their voice when I did, I thought that meant they were in it. I thought that was love. But he never did those things. He didn't match my emotional chaos. He absorbed it. And at first, that made me feel like I was alone in the room, like he wasn't connecting. But over time, I saw it for what it was: regulation. He was teaching me, without saying a word, that connection doesn't require combustion. Sometimes it requires stillness. He didn't flood me with affection. He wasn't overly physical. He didn't smother me with compliments. And it made me question, at times, whether he even cared. But then I'd remember the way he noticed when I was tired without saying it. The way he let me have silence without asking what was wrong. The way he never interrupted, never pushed, never made me feel rushed. His love wasn't loud, it was present. And when you're used to being overwhelmed by false intensity, presence can feel like absence until you learn to see the difference. There was a day I asked him, half joking, "Why don't you try harder to make me feel safe?" He looked at me for a moment, not offended, not shaken. And then he said, "Because safety isn't something I give you. It's something you recognize when you're ready." That hit deeper than I expected. He wasn't withholding sweetness. He was offering structure, offering stillness, offering space. And in a world where love is often given conditionally, his love stood with arms crossed, not to block me, but to prove it wouldn't collapse. He wasn't interested in being my emotional project. He didn't ask me to build him, save him, or decode him. He knew who he was, knew what he wanted. And that kind of certainty used to intimidate me. I was used to being the strong one, the emotionally aware one. But around him, I didn't feel needed, I felt met. And that changed everything, because for the first time, I wasn't proving myself. I was simply showing up, and the absence of pressure to fix someone else gave me the space to feel whole. What made me feel safest with him wasn't how he held me, but how he held his own ground. He never wavered just to soothe me. He never lied to make me feel better. He told the truth, even when it was hard, even when I didn't want to hear it. And that honesty, that calm conviction, built something between us that sugar never could trust. He didn't earn it with charm. He built it through consistency. And in a world full of men who speak softly but move inconsistently, he was the first man whose silence I never had to doubt. There's something rare about a man who doesn't try to impress you, who doesn't put on a performance of strength, but simply is strong. He didn't boast. He didn't compete. He wasn't interested in being more charming, more sensitive, more emotional than other men. He wasn't interested in comparison at all. He was just grounded, so grounded that I could fall apart next to him and not worry about dragging him down. His security gave me room to be insecure, and that, ironically, made me feel more secure than any sweet words ever had. I'd spent years around men who mistook intensity for intimacy. They'd hold me too tight when I cried, then disappear when I calmed down. They'd overpromise and underdeliver, showing up in sparks but never in structure. He was different. His comfort didn't come wrapped in passion. It came wrapped in reliability. He didn't make me feel high, but he made me feel safe. And once you've experienced that kind of steadiness, all the fireworks in the world can't replace the feeling of finally being able to exhale. I tested him the way wounded women sometimes do. I'd get cold, distant. I'd say things I didn't mean just to see if he'd react. But he never played along. He didn't chase. He didn't try to fix what I hadn't asked to fix. He gave me space, and even in silence, his presence never disappeared. He was still there, not hovering, not punishing, just waiting for me to come back to myself. And when I did, he didn't say I told you so. He didn't gloat. He just looked at me like I had never left. That kind of emotional patience. It redefined safety. The moment I realized I was safe wasn't during an argument or a breakdown. It was in the middle of an ordinary day. We were driving. Quiet, no music, no conversation, just the road and the rhythm of his breath. And suddenly I felt it, that deep, wordless calm. Not because he was holding my hand or telling me how much I meant to him, but because I knew, without needing a single word, that he wouldn't leave if I stopped talking. That he wouldn't crumble if I had a bad day. That he wasn't going anywhere. That was safety. He didn't protect me with promises. He protected me with presence. He didn't speak in poetry. He moved with purpose. His version of love wasn't dramatic, but it was dependable. And that changed everything, because I started to realize I didn't need someone to save me. I needed someone who wouldn't shake when I did, who wouldn't make my storm about him, who wouldn't need to be held just to stay. He was the first man who didn't wrap safety in sweetness. He wrapped it in stillness, and that stillness became my sanctuary. Being with him taught me that safety isn't about being comforted, it's about not being disturbed. He didn't soothe every insecurity with words. He didn't crowd me with affection. He gave me space to be uncomfortable without making it worse. At first, I thought that meant he was emotionally unavailable. But it was the opposite. He was emotionally responsible. He didn't need to fix me to feel useful. He didn't collapse just because I did. His stability wasn't soft, it was steel. And it held everything together, even when I couldn't. He didn't walk on eggshells around my emotions. He didn't tiptoe through hard conversations. He told the truth, even when it didn't sound kind. But it was real, and in that truth, I felt something I never expected, safety. Because deep down, I knew he would never manipulate me with kindness. He wasn't trying to win points. He was trying to build something honest. And when a man gives you truth instead of sugar, consistency instead of charm, you start to realize that real protection often looks like clear boundaries, not comforting lies. When I talked, he didn't nod just to agree. He didn't echo my opinions to keep the peace. He listened. He processed. And when he responded, it was with clarity, not performance. He challenged me sometimes, not to dominate, but to engage. And in those moments, when he stood firm in himself, I felt strangely protected. Because I knew he wasn't pretending. I knew he wasn't adjusting himself just to keep me happy. He was anchored. And being around someone anchored lets you stop holding everything up on your own. With other men, I often felt the need to manage the emotional climate, to soften my words, to monitor their reactions, to keep things smooth. But with him, I didn't have to do any of that. He didn't crumble when things got uncomfortable. He didn't take my anger personally. He let me have my experience without making it about him. And that changed everything, because I stopped performing calmness and started feeling it. Not because he calmed me, but because he didn't make my storm about him. His strength wasn't loud. It didn't flex itself. It didn't command the room. It held it quietly. And that holding, steady, constant, grounded, became the foundation for something I'd never known before: safety without sweetness, love without rescue, presence without pressure. He didn't need to be my everything. He needed to be himself. And by doing that, by being consistent, composed, and emotionally self-led, he gave me something I didn't even know I was craving: a love that didn't shake when I did. A love I could rest inside. I spent so many nights whispering, "Do you love me?" into the darkness, desperate for a reassurance that never came in the same way with him. His love wasn't a daily chorus of words that needed repetition. It was a deep, unyielding presence that permeated every silent moment between us. I used to think that having to ask that question meant I wasn't truly loved, that something was missing. But he never needed to constantly declare his feelings, because he embodied love through his unwavering strength and calm resolve. His quiet demeanor, which I once misunderstood as distance, was in fact a steady, resolute form of affection, a love that required no ornamentation, no constant verbal affirmation, just a steadfast presence that allowed me to feel secure without endless questioning. It dawned on me over time that a man who doesn't feel compelled to repeatedly say "I love you" is not neglectful or detached. He understands that true love is proven by consistent action, not by the frequency of spoken words. In his presence, I learned that emotional strength doesn't need to be loud to be convincing. When I was with others, I often found myself fishing for those little assurances, the ever-present "Do you love me?" that seemed to hang in the air like a fragile plea for validation. But with him, every glance, every quiet act of kindness, and every moment of gentle understanding told me more about his love than any hastily uttered phrase ever could. His calm, deliberate way of being provided a safe harbor where doubts had no space to grow. Over time, I began to understand that if you have to constantly ask, "Do you love me?" it might be a sign that you're not experiencing the kind of love that a truly strong man offers. The strong man doesn't measure his worth or your importance with repetitious declarations. His love is implicit, woven into the fabric of every action he takes. When he chooses to remain silent during moments of uncertainty, it isn't indifference. It's the manifestation of a secure foundation that stands firm despite external storms. I realized that my constant need for verbal reassurance was more a reflection of my own insecurities than of any failing on his part. His strength was in his ability to maintain his composure, proving that real affection can be both powerful and understated. I remember questioning his quiet resolve during times when my own fears were at their peak. I'd ask, "Do you really love me?" Not out of disbelief in his commitment, but because I was accustomed to the noisy validations that come from a less secure type of love. The man I was with never had to compensate for his authenticity with redundant words. Instead, he let his actions speak with a silence that resonated louder than any adoration-filled sentence. His subtle glances, thoughtful gestures, and respectful distance were all part of a mature form of love, a love that doesn't need to be reaffirmed every minute because its stability is self-evident. I slowly learned that if his love was as strong as I felt, I would no longer need to ask, because I would recognize its presence in every quiet, enduring moment. Looking back now, I realized that the endless questioning, "Do you love me?" was my way of seeking reassurance in a language I wasn't ready to understand. A truly strong man provides his love not by filling every silence with words, but by creating a secure space where his feelings are evident through reliability and consistent care. His love was demonstrated in how he showed up every day, in the small, thoughtful actions that required no repetition. Eventually, I began to sense that if you have to keep asking for affirmation, perhaps you've never experienced the kind of love that is self-assured and constant. And in that realization, I finally understood that his silent strength was everything I needed, even if it wasn't wrapped up in the sweet, constant "I love yous" I once craved. there came a point when I stopped needing him to say it. I started recognizing it in the way he never flinched when I was overwhelmed, never pulled away when I grew quiet, never filled the space just to avoid discomfort. His love wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical. It was steady, grounded, deeply woven into how he carried himself around me. And I began to realize I had been chasing something performative for so long, I almost missed the real thing standing right in front of me. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken every hour to still be true every second. Other men had said it, "I love you," like clockwork. After arguments, during vulnerable moments, even when they didn't mean it, they used it as a balm, as a tool, as a reflex. But he didn't say it just because I was hurting. He didn't say it to stop me from walking out. He said it only when it was earned, when his actions had built something solid enough to carry the weight of those words. And when he finally did, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a confirmation of something I already knew. The most surprising part was how safe I felt even in silence. I used to associate safety with closeness, and closeness with constant dialogue. But with him, we could sit in stillness for hours and I'd never feel disconnected. His presence didn't ask me to speak just to prove intimacy. It didn't demand affection to feel secure, and that was the first time I realized maybe real safety isn't created by attention, it's created by stability. And his was the kind you don't find in grand romantic gestures, but in the pause where nothing is said, and yet nothing feels missing. I noticed how other people reacted to him too, how his stillness made them speak softer, how his calmness made a room feel more grounded. He didn't try to dominate with energy, he regulated it. And when I stood beside him, I could feel my nervous system sensing with his. Not because he was emotionally distant, but because he was emotionally anchored. His strength wasn't reactive, it was foundational. And that kind of energy doesn't need to say, "I love you" 10 times a day. It says it once and lives it every day after. I don't ask anymore, "Do you love me?" It's not because I've stopped caring. It's because I finally know what real love feels like without needing to hear it. It feels like presence, like consistency, like someone who holds your chaos without absorbing it, like knowing you could fall apart and he wouldn't rush to fix you, just sit there with you calmly until you found your footing again. His love didn't carry me, it stood beside me. And when I learned to see it for what it truly was, I no longer needed the words, I had the proof. By the time I understood his kind of love, I could barely remember why I ever doubted it. It wasn't that he loved differently. It was that I had been taught to recognize love only in its most dramatic, most verbal forms. I was trained to think affection had to be loud to be real, but his presence rewrote that story. He never had to raise his voice, or fight for my attention, or whisper sweet nothings to remind me he cared. He was just there, consistently, completely. And the more I sat in that quiet, the more I realized real love doesn't convince, it simply continues. I started noticing how my body reacted around him. Not butterflies, not adrenaline, but peace. My shoulders dropped, my breathing slowed. There was no second guessing, no mental tug of war trying to decode his tone or intentions. He didn't create emotional tension for the sake of passion. He brought balance. And that's when I realized something that broke my heart a little. I had mistaken emotional instability for emotional depth. What he gave me wasn't roller coasters, it was reliability. And that, it turns out, is far more intimate than chaos. There were times I watched other couples and felt envious, their PDA, their sweet nicknames, their constant compliments. And yet, I never felt more emotionally safe than I did beside him. He didn't need to display love to validate it. He didn't need to curate affection for an audience. His loyalty was quiet, his presence was consistent. And now, when I see those public displays, I ask myself, do they feel safe behind the curtain? Because I did with him. Even in the quietest moments, I felt like I had nothing to prove and nowhere to hide. It took me a long time to realize how many times he showed me love in the absence of words, in the way he never interrupted me, in how he remembered things I forgot I'd said, in how he stayed calm even when I was anything but. He didn't say I love you every day, but he never gave me a reason to question it either. And that's when I understood his love wasn't about performance, it was about permanence. And permanence doesn't ask for applause, it just stays quietly through everything. If you've ever been loved by a man like him, It's not the sweetness that gets to you, it's the steadiness. It's the fact that he never tried to win you over with charm. He didn't sell you on a version of himself. He showed up as he was and let you decide if you were ready for that kind of presence. I almost wasn't. I almost walked away from it looking for something louder. But now I know sweetness fades. Stillness stays. And the kind of love that holds its ground without saying a word is the kind that lasts. When people ask me now what made me feel safest with him, I don't talk about the romantic gestures because there weren't many. I talk about the silence, the kind where nothing needed to be said because nothing felt uncertain. I talk about the way his energy never changed when I got moody or tired or emotional. He didn't try to fix my sadness. He didn't make me feel like my vulnerability was inconvenient. He stayed calm, present, not trying to rescue me, but letting me rescue myself in his presence. And that changed everything. He never promised to catch me. He never needed to. Because deep down I knew if I fell, he wouldn't panic. He wouldn't collapse under the weight of my fear. He'd simply be there. And sometimes that's more powerful than any vow. I didn't need him to say, "I'll protect you." I just needed to sit beside him and feel how little he wavered. That unshakable presence taught me that safety isn't loud or dramatic. It's knowing that no matter what breaks inside you, someone beside you won't. Looking back, I understand now why his kind of love confused me. It didn't activate my survival patterns. It didn't trigger adrenaline or fear. It didn't make me chase or shrink or perform. It made me rest. And when you're used to emotional instability, rest can feel like boredom. But it wasn't boredom. It was regulation. It was stability. It was peace. I just didn't know how to receive it at the time, because no one had ever taught me that a man could be strong, silent, and still deeply loving. The world doesn't teach us to look for safety in men. It teaches us to look for spark, for excitement, for obsession. But now I measure love by a different standard. Can I breathe next to him? Can I be quiet without being questioned? Can I break down without being abandoned? With him, the answer was yes, always yes. And the beauty of it was, he never said those words to reassure me. He just lived them. His love didn't need to convince. It simply showed up day after day, without fail. Now, when I think of the word safe, I think of him. Not because he wrapped me in warmth or said all the right things, but because his presence never made me feel like I had to earn my place. He didn't use sweetness to soothe me. He used strength to hold me steady. And while I once craved soft words, I've learned that softness can fade. But strength, real, quiet, grounded strength that stays. He wasn't sweet in the traditional sense. But he made me feel more safe than anyone ever had. And that, I've learned, is what lasts. With time, I realized his safety wasn't something he gave me. It was something he held for me until I was ready to claim it. He didn't rush my healing. He didn't interrupt my processing. He didn't try to mold my pain into something more palatable. He just made space for it. Firm, unshakable space. And I look back now with awe, because I've since learned how rare that is. Most people want to change you to soothe themselves. He never needed that. He didn't fear my depth. He stood beside it like he had depth of his own. I remember one afternoon when everything felt wrong. My world was loud, my mind was spinning, and I was barely holding myself together. I walked into the room, and he didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't smother me in concern. He just looked up, met my eyes, and nodded once. No words, no judgment, just present. And in that moment, I didn't feel fixed. I felt seen, not as someone broken, but as someone whole, even in the chaos. That kind of recognition, it settles in your bones and never quite leaves. We didn't talk about emotions much. He didn't use love language like it was currency. But I could always feel the weight of his devotion. It was in how he moved through the world. Deliberate, clear, unrushed. I used to think emotional safety came from shared vulnerability, from soft words and emotional exposure. But he taught me another version, one rooted in consistency, in maturity, in a man so grounded in himself that he made you feel safe just by not flinching. That kind of energy doesn't whisper comfort, it radiates it. After him, I found myself searching for that kind of stillness again. Not sweetness, not romance, but stillness. That quiet masculine presence that doesn't falter when you tremble. The man who doesn't need to explain his love because it's felt in every gesture. I met others who tried to imitate it, men who said the right things, did the textbook version of emotional support, but it never landed because they weren't rooted. He was. And once you've known a love that holds steady without the sweetness, you stop mistaking softness for safety. He never asked me to trust him. He just made it impossible not to. And that's the difference. Trust wasn't a request. It was a byproduct of how he showed up, of how he never made my feelings a burden, of how he stayed steady in moments where most would shift, deflect, or retreat. That kind of love doesn't require promises. It requires presence. And the more I reflect on what made me feel safe with him, the more I see it wasn't the things he said. It was the strength in what he never had to. If I could tell him one thing now, it wouldn't be "I miss you." It would be "I get it." I understand now why he didn't rush to comfort me with soft words, why he didn't try to rescue me from myself. His calm wasn't a lack of care, it was a form of leadership. It was him showing me I was capable of sitting in discomfort without collapsing. And back then, I thought love was supposed to catch you. But he showed me something stronger: love that doesn't catch you, but lets you land on your own 2 feet without ever walking away. I've stopped craving sweetness, not because it's wrong, but because it's easy to fake. Sweet words can be spoken by anyone, flowers can be bought by anyone, but grounded presence, emotional maturity, the kind of man who doesn't flinch when you fall apart, who doesn't retreat when you're too much, that's rare. That's not taught in love songs. That's built through stillness, self-respect, and deep internal strength. And now, when someone asks what made me feel most loved, I say, he never tried to rescue me. He let me rescue myself beside him. Sometimes, I wonder if he knew what he was doing, if he understood the long game he was playing. That one day, when the noise in my life quieted, I'd look back and finally hear everything his silence was saying. I used to think love needed to be loud to be felt. But now I know his silence wasn't absence. It was assurance. It was the confidence of a man who didn't need to convince me, who let his presence say what words never could. And now, even in his absence, that presence is still what I return to. The world teaches women to look for romance, for reassurance, for sweetness. But no one teaches us to look for strength, not the aggressive kind, but the quiet kind. The kind of strength that can hold space without control, that can hear your fears without needing to fix them, that doesn't take your pain personally, that doesn't confuse attention for love. He was that kind of man. And now, long after we've parted, I've stopped looking for butterflies. I'm looking for the man who doesn't promise to hold me, only proves he'll never drop me. So, no, his love didn't feel sweet. It felt solid. It felt like walking into a storm and knowing the ground beneath you won't shift. And while I once wished he'd been more romantic, more expressive, more traditionally tender, I wouldn't trade his steadiness for any of it. Because when everything in me wanted to fall apart, he never tried to patch me up. He just stayed strong, unmoving. And now I know the safest place in the world isn't someone's arms. It's being beside someone who never shakes when you do. That was him. And that was enough.